everyday living all came together in my particular focus on weather by mail. And we'll see in a moment how these things are related. The area is quite extensive, and as I mentioned in the first slide here, this is part one of a much longer story. And basically, I'll be going from the beginning of weather observations up through approximately 1900 as it's developed here in the United States. As the subtitle suggests, is Meteorology and Weather Forecasts in the United States Postal History. And as Ben Franklin, as we all familiar with his relationship with the postal system and his many witty sayings, some people are weather-wise and some are otherwise. The cover on the title page here is kind of an interesting one. If you notice in the upper right-hand corner, it indicates, "In haste, never mind the weather." So communication by mail is very important in early days of the United States and the original British colonies. And we had mentioned discussion earlier in the meeting about the Boston Post Road, and that was the key communications up and down the eastern seaboard, where most of the major cities and states were located, and how the news and the revolution developed along that route. Many of us have heard the familiar inscription, "Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds." And certainly the writer of this letter had that in mind when he wrote, "In haste, never mind the weather." Okay, next. In the colonial period, a lot of people, or many people, were interested in recording the weather observations, and you'll find in early colonial records charts that people made and references in personal diaries of what the weather was on a day-to-day basis. This is a document that illustrates. Let's see what year. Here. So in the next slide is a little more detailed in meteorological observations made at Spring Mill in near Philadelphia, and it indicated the temperature and the barometric readings and the winds and whether there was any precipitation and so forth. So going back, this dates back to 1788, but you'll find earlier diaries and records that go back even earlier than that. The people kept track of the environment. Back then, there were the knowledge of weather and meteorological trends was not really understood. And as you'll see in most of these slides here, these observations were done at the surface. People did not understand how storms or weather fronts moved. They had no idea of upper wind effects, the effects of ocean currents, and so forth. The issue started to arise in the early days, in the early 1800s. Next slide. as the country developed, the government obviously formed a post office, and people started moving west and settling the interior of the United States. The Western expansion continued right through the 1800s, and most commerce, as it developed, relied on waterways for carrying goods and materials. Train service and inventions really came not until the 1830s and 40s to any great extent, but the early development of the country was by rivers and canals, the Mississippi, obviously, the Hudson River, even locally the Charles River to some extent, and the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes, of course, more toward the center of this, but there were huge storms in the Great Lakes, and shipping losses were extraordinary. The storms in the Great Lakes come up very suddenly, and without any weather forecasts or weather reports, people had no idea what was happening. Farmers in the agricultural areas often were devastated where storms came up seemingly from nowhere or without any particular warning, and hay crops or other crops were spoiled. So the need for some understanding was quite critical. This is a wood engraving from one of the early pictorial magazines showing the great violence of the storms in the Great Lakes. Again, the next slide, Scribner's Monthly from 1871 showed the great storms, and articles started to appear talking about the weather and what could be done to forecast and understand this. The next slide. The United States Army, of course, was quite active. The military was quite active during the Civil War in the early 1860s. And part of the military was a signal service that communicated information to different parts of the military. Chiefly because of the great invention in 1837 when Samuel Morse perfected his telegraph system. And this was a way to get information around the country quite quickly. The chief signal officer of the Army was Albert Meyer, and this is a official cover, as you can see in the upper right corner, with his free frame. Albert Meyer is about to play a very key role in weather by mail. Next. This is a kind of an unusual cover. It's the only one I've found either in my searches or in research. But since the Army had a group of individuals who could be relied on a regular basis, the Army started to, in response to the joint congressional resolutions, started to take meteorological observations. They recorded obviously the temperature, the wind, the precipitation, and so forth, and on a regular daily basis. And that information was telegraphed to Washington, where it was kind of combined together into reports that included a synopsis and probabilities, which we now know as forecasts and other facts. So by the mid-1870s, the Signal Service issued their daily reports, what they called weather reports, called Farmers Bulletin, that gave farmers and people in commerce the information they needed to hopefully have a little advanced warning as to what storms and weather fronts might be moving around. They still didn't fully understand how weather moved, but nonetheless, the information was gathered together in a systematic way. And with the active cooperation with the Post Office Department, the so-called Farmers Bulletins were printed, mailed, and displayed in special frames at each post office, over almost 7,000 post offices around the country, by 2 o'clock each day. So if you were concerned or wanted to know whether to harvest your hay or wait till the next clear day, you check at the post office, the bulletin board, and the Farmers Bulletin would give you some idea of what was going to happen in short run. So here we have a very close cooperation between the Army Signal Corps and the Post Office Department at the direction of the under congressional mandate. This is an early map, kind of a crude one by today's standards, from the New York Daily Graphic of 1876, and it's showing the idea of the belts of storms and how storms kind of moved up around the coast and from west to east. And at this time, we're developing kind of a law or understanding of the law of storms, so that we could make more reliable predictions. The weather observations, obviously, as I had mentioned, are taken from all around the country, and these were weather observations taken on a regular basis in Boston, first at the old State House, but then the Signal Service had an actual office in the new, at the time, in quotations, post office. This is one of the original post office buildings in Post Office Square. Obviously, that building is no longer there. It's gone through several different buildings over time here. But if you look at the red writing at the top of the card, it indicates that occupied by Post Office Department, Pension Department, United States Court, Lighthouse Departments, and the Signal Service. And the Signal Service was the Army Signal Service, and reports from all around New England were telegraphed to Boston here, and where they put together their daily reports. There were also reports received from the Blue Hill Observatory in Milton, which many of us are familiar with, when that was in operation a decade or two later. It was an early photograph of the Great Blue Hill. Next, this is a printed report from the meteorological record from 1873, and it lists all of the nature places of observation on the left of different cities and in towns around the country, and the wind speed, the clouds, precipitation, the state of the weather and so forth. So they were very careful and up-to-date records and observations being recorded several times a day, telegraphed to Washington for compilation, and then telegraphed out to the various cities, major cities and hubs around the country, and for printing of the so-called Farmers Bulletin, and posted on the post office department's wall. Here's an actual one of those reports that date from 1870. The next slide. This one was in Washington, D.C. in March of 1873 at 7:35 a.m. and indicating a synopsis of what the observations were and the probabilities. The rest of Tuesday in New England, New York, rising barometric brisk northwest winds, falling temperature, partly cloudy, and so forth. So these were the actual weather reports, or what they called then probabilities of what the weather was to be. And all of this information disseminated through the post office department. As you can see, they're really quite detailed. Next. This is an example, typical of the weather maps that were constantly being generated in this period several times a day. Again, bringing together and consolidating the information from all the weather observations throughout the central and eastern part of the United States. And as you can see, this was done by the War Department, Signal Service of the United States Army. This is a map from, again, from 1873. I'm trying to give you an idea of what the technology was, what the information was, and how it was disseminated in this very early days of the Weather Service. Next. That's another map from the period, and they were beginning to get with these observations and putting the maps together. People would have a greater sense and context of how the weather moved across the country. The barometric pressures, the high and low, as you can see there, the indications of temperatures and so forth. So it was a science of meteorology developing. As an aside point, similarly, the weather observations relied on instruments and technology, the barometer, the thermometer, and the wind indicators, and measuring the precipitation and so forth. So there were scientific instruments, and meteorology was accepted and regarded as a science. Also in that same period, in the 1870s and 80s, what we know today as philately, or the hobby of stamp collecting, was regarded both in the United States and in Europe as a science. And there were developed scientific tools. Those so-called, like the perforation detectors, and which was developed in France, and the use of tongs and other tools of philately in measuring cancellations and actual study of stamps and their production and so forth. So philately was regarded as a science like many other endeavors Now I think it's considered more of a hobby or an intellectual pursuit, but back then it was considered an actual science. This is a copy of the War Department Signal Service. This was the first formal weather report, and in November 17, 1872. So this was give you an idea of those who are interested in first days or the beginnings of things. This is the first weather report, and as I say, it was distributed to post offices. The next couple of slides are from my collection. These are the original weather reports. This one is from 1874 from Cincinnati. But what got me interested in this whole area to begin with was an article in a Philadelphia journal by a leading philatelist who had run across one of these farmers' bulletins. And well, as you can see from the total, War Department Office, Chief Signal Officer, Division of Telegraphs and Reports for the Bureau of Commerce and Agriculture, Washington, D.C. And that was what the Weather Bureau, as it was to later be known, was known as the Telegraph and Reports for the benefit of commerce and agriculture. The article pictured one of these weather reports, and she's indicated she had been looking throughout her Philadelphia career. This is the only one she had ever found. She found a few copies in the Smithsonian and so forth, and was very curious about it. And when I started finding a few of these, there was more than just the ones she knew about. They're out there, but people didn't really realize or connect the dots, so to speak. So the next slide shows one. This is a photograph of the one in the Smithsonian collection, and again, one of the very early reports from 1879. This was the only one the Smithsonian had, and was quite typical of the day. If you've got a report or a piece of paper, and then it done its usefulness, one waste not, want not. We use the paper for other notations, for grocery lists, etc. So next. Again, an example of a later example of the Farmer's Bulletin. This one from 1883, and indicating the indications. Now, the reason I showed you a number of these Farmer's Bulletins, when we look at the next slide, were mailed. Not only were posted in the post office, but were actually mailed out to people. There were colleges and universities that were interested in the weather. But they also needed to be mailed to each local post office. So they were folded up and put in these wrappers. Some of you who are familiar with postal stationery know of newspaper wrappers where periodicals are folded up, wrapped in a wrapper, and then you either put a adhesive stamp on it, or in postal stationery terms, sometimes the indicia was printed right on the wrapper itself. And all you had to do was wrap it around your mailing, and we can seal the flap, and off it would go. So this is example of how these weather reports were actually sent to the local post offices. These two examples actually used War Department official stamps, again showing the close cooperation between the Army Signal Service and the War Department, and with the cooperation of the Post Office Department. And these are, as I say, war official, U.S. official stamps from the War Department. To speed things along, it was rather, speed was important here, so rather than handwriting, if we had hundreds of these to send out every morning, they would print up little strips of paper of the various cities and towns, and we just stick on one, the lower one, you can see was sent to the postmaster of Troy, New York. So all you do is stick that Troy, New York on, and off it went to the post office to be posted on the bulletin board. Here's an example of postal stationery. This is a newspaper wrapper. It's folded in 3 pieces here, so it looks like an envelope. It's actually a wrapper. And this has a pre-cancel indicating the War Department. Any person using this wrapper for private purposes will be found guilty of a misdemeanor and be subject to a fine of $300. And even today,
it was a lot of money.
Yeah, but even today, if you get official mail, it'll have that same warning, and the $300 fine hasn't changed since the 1870s.
That was a house in 1870.
Yeah. Well, tampering with the mails was considered, or abuse of the mails was rampant then, particularly among legislators and other public officials. So they really clamped down on it. This is actually an extremely rare one. This is the only example ever found of this particular pre-cancel and overprint, and it was from a collection of a postal stationery specialist, Marcus White, who lived and worked for the Norton Company, no relation, in Worcester, Massachusetts for many years. And he amassed a huge holding of postal stationery in the United States. And his collection was later dispersed. And it's just the band down below was slipped over the wrapper to identify the stand and the date and so forth. Those bands down below are commonly used by postal stationery collectors. And if you get involved in stamped envelopes or wrappers from named or famous collections, you'll often see bands like that. Here's another example of a wrapper that again was mailed. This one was mailed to the Chicago Produce Exchange in 1992, and this wrapper had the circular, a different franking penalty form up in the upper right-hand corner. People who collect official franks or official mail, frank mail, get into the different varieties of the indicia in the upper right-hand corner. So now you'll notice at this point, the time it's let's see, it was in 1891. The state was really 1892. In 1891, the U.S. Army Signal Service transferred its work to the Agricultural Department. So from 1891 to 1940, the collection of weather observations and reports and compiling them and sending them out to post offices and to people who were subscribed. Even you back then could have, written to the post agriculture department, please send me your daily weather reports, and they would do so as a public document and information that you were entitled to as a taxpayer. So this again documents the change from the cooperation between the Army Signal Service and Post Office Department to the cooperation between the Agriculture Department and the Post Office Department. Next. This is another format of the wrappers. Just see, as I say, these are not envelopes. They're three trifold wrappers that went around the actual weather report. Next. In addition to the weather reports, farmers' bulletins, which were basically your standard 8.5 by 11 or a little smaller letter sheet. The Department of Agriculture, because of the volume of reports that they send out each and every day, they went to a format of cards. This is actually a official postcard. It's not a postal card because it doesn't have a stamp on it, but it does have the free frank of the Post Office Department. And you can see the front of it where it was sent. And on the back, each day, they printed a brief summary of what the weather was going to be within the next 12 to 24 hours. This was one that was actually typeset and printed. They had small printing presses in the major cities like Boston and New York, Philadelphia, to print the hundreds or thousands that they needed for that day. They also, in the smaller post offices, they had huge rubber stamps that had little slots in it, and they had a whole box of these rubber stamps that said sunny or rain or rising temperatures and so forth, that they just slipped into the hand stamp, and with their ink pad and hand stamp would stamp the back of one of these cards, and off they went to the local post office. This is the last section of my part one talk, but it's an interesting development. There was a lot of criticism in the late 1800s of the U.S. mail system. People always seem to have some argument or complaints of the regularity and timeliness of the mail service. And in the 1880s and 90s, and 1890s in particular, was no exception. So this is a letter that was from 1895, when there was a convention of postmasters and so forth, and at the convention of the State Weather Service directors in Indianapolis, the director came up with a suggestion that the concept of backstamping letters be extended to these mailings of the weather observations. The post office at that time, in order to get more accountability for the local postmaster, had a directive whereby the postmaster receiving a bag of mail had to backstamp each letter with the date and time it was received. And this way people would know when the letter actually got to the local post office and how long it sat there days, weeks, until it was actually delivered. So this was really a prod to most postmasters and delivery people you had to process the mail and deliver it as timely as possible. So that whole concept was picked up and discussed at this particular convention. And they said, no, we're doing this anyway with the back stamping. How about this as an idea? That in the back stamp itself, we include sort of a mini weather report or weather indication. Next. This is for those of you who want the details. This is a enlargement of what that letter actually said. Next. So here the next few slides are examples of these hand stamps. You'll see on the top in magenta, it's a little hard to read, but this is one from the weather forecast for tomorrow. The letter was received December 28, 1895 in Huron and indicated snow and cold weather coming up. It's cut off a little bit at the top here, but that's the actual post office back stamp with the weather report on it. Here's another one. Another weather forecast receiving mark. One was from Sandusky, Ohio in 1896. Weather forecast for tomorrow, warmer.
Helpful.
Yeah. Well, it was. I mean, if we had a weather forecast today that said cooler tomorrow, we'd be in pretty good spirits.
Yeah, true.
Here's one from 1896 from Columbus, Ohio. Weather forecast for tomorrow, fair and warmer. And you can see again, they're a little faint because these are all rubber stamped. They had little slots in them for the words. And it also has another auxiliary marking of that missent in the front of the stamp. Now, I will say that it is a real challenge to find these. These are not common. I found probably a dozen over a 25-year period. So these auxiliary back stamp weather forecasts are hard to come by, and people didn't pay much attention to them. As you can see, here's one from Waukegan, Illinois, with the clear receive mark on the, let's see, the next slide. Yeah, there we go. In red on the left, it's a little easier to read, but they're going to comply with the post office mandate of date and time stamp of the particular letter. Next. Read it here. This is again another one from Waukegan, Illinois. This one you couldn't read too much. It says weather, and this illegible something HT tomorrow. So they were carelessly struck in the parts of the back stamp were off the envelope, so kind of defeated the purpose of the program. Next. One that's a little easier to read. This is from Canton from New York. Again, not a great deal of information, but you know, it gave you some heads up. It's probably about as much as you get on a quick weather report on the radio today. Next. Columbia, Missouri Fair and Warmer. This was in December of 1896. And next, with a circular format, Rains Tuesday, local Rains Tuesday. This is from Lansing, Michigan. There are quite a few, I say quite a few, Lansing is probably the one you should find most of. But again, they're very, very elusive, hard to come by. Next. This one from a postal card from Canada. And since
No.
Hmm?
Nah, I was just reading this.
Oh, yeah. The question would come up with post office, what do they do with postcards and postal cards? If you stamp the back of them, you're obliterating the message off of it, obviously, or defacing it. So quite often, if you find the receiving mark, it will often be on the front of the card. This one's pretty well struck, actually. Round receiving mark next to with the postmark over it. Another next, another Lansing, Michigan. Again, the unusual use of the face of the card. Showers tonight, Thursday, partly cloudy. This is a little more informative than some of the others. But this idea was also picked up in Mexico, and they took it a step further. They actually had canceling machines that were used as receiving to print the receiving mark. Next. Again, from Lansing, Michigan. It's a fairly nicely struck reverse cancellation. There's never been a complete or formal catalog. Pilatus like to catalog everything, and there's a very active auxiliary marking society that documents all different kinds of auxiliary markings, whether it's missent or additional postage due or big pointing hand return to sender, all that sort of thing. They've started to catalog these weather forecast receiving stamps, but there are so few of them and so few recordings of it. The information is still being gathered. The use of the forecast back stamp was discontinued formally in November of 1897, and as indicated on the page, the postmaster reported, given great satisfaction to the public and many regret that its use is to be discontinued, but so it was. Next. There's another one from Canton, New York. Oh, fair. At least you knew you didn't have to take your umbrella or something. Next. This is another format. Tomorrow, fair and warmer. This was kind of a linear type receiving hand stamp. Again, complied with post office regulations for the time and date of the receipt of the letter, and this, with research, you've been able to locate who made some of these hand stamp receiving postal marking devices, and you get the hand stamp and then a box of numbers and letters. So I would change the dates at times, obviously, several times a day, and then also little strips that would indicate fair, warmer, and all that sort of thing. And so the local postmaster would make them up. And as you've seen, they're in circular format and then this more linear format. The original letter that I showed at the beginning of this section indicated to the local postmasters what companies actually produce these items. So the local postmaster had to pay for his own, but at least they know where to order them. Here's one forecast rain for the next day. Yeah, this really doesn't come under the, shall we say, umbrella of post-1890 short experiment in back stamp weather reports. But this is a commercial letter I found in the dollar box decades ago, in which the local Chamber of Commerce distributed these little hand stamps. This is non-official post office business, with the back stamp of Green Cove Springs, Florida, Weather Today Fair Sunday, trying to promote the wonderful weather and the tourist
every day, no matter what the weather actually is.
It is, yeah. And actually, over the years, I've found a few things of similar idea, and again, it's using mail and advertising and mail and the post to distribute information about the weather and the climate of the different areas. And the last slide, maybe to weather the current pandemic. This when we had the pandemic before, but now we can add heat wave in there. And the wind always be at your back, and may the sun shine warm on your face, and may we see you at the next meeting.
Thank you.
I have with me a notebook of not most pages, but similar material to show you the kind of range of things that one can collect